Where will we? Got it. I also need to mute this tab because otherwise I hear myself speaking and I don't want to do that, like everybody. So thanks everyone for coming along to .NET Knots. Before we get going, we do have a code of conduct that I mentioned to a few folks earlier. There's a lot of words on there, but really it just boils down to be nice to people because, well, it makes it a nice atmosphere in here and it's just nicer to be that way. Now, if anybody else along tonight has any problems that they feel are breaking our code of conduct, then just send me a direct message in the chat and I'll deal with that straight away and keep you up to speed with how that's progressing so that we can make sure that everybody's happy. If you need some more information, there's a bit.ly there in the bottom right-hand corner that you can go and check out. So moving on, thanks very much to our sponsors tonight. BGSS is where the people that have come in person are physically sitting. So thanks very much to them for putting up with us and staying late in the evening and providing a space to keep our drinks. That nice segue into Cordius, who are sponsoring our in-person drinks and food. I think the food will be okay tonight. I'll order like a couple of pizzas and we'll be full. So if you've got any allergies or anything, let me know before I do that, so that we can cater for those people that are here. And then onwards from that, Calyx AI, they are sponsoring us a book, which I will ask Matt to choose later, which, if he's got any sense, will be a XAML-based book, of course. And then we'll give that out at some point after tonight's meetup. And then likewise, the same for JetBrains. We've got a JetBrains license to give away. And then my consultancy firm, because, you know, we pay for the hosting and things like that. I mentioned a second ago that JetBrains, they're sponsoring us a license, a 12-month license to any one of their products. If you don't know what JetBrains do, they make developer tools for developers. So things like Rider and IntelliJ, WebStorm, PHPStorm, ReSharper, all of those type tools. And they're giving away a 12-month license to any one of those particular products. And if you tweet on the hashtag .NET Knots at some point after tonight's meetup, then we will draw that and I'll get in touch on Twitter. So make sure you're following .NET Knots and we can follow you back and drop you a DM for that. Likewise for the book, which will most likely be XAML flavored, but not necessarily. It might surprise you and, you know, give you a Mills and Boon story or something like that. Maybe that's a bit old for lots of people. Anyway, there'll be a draw for the same hashtag .NET Knots, and we'll draw that out at some point after tonight's meetup. And myself, and you're an MVP as well, aren't you? And Matt are Microsoft MVPs. If you've not heard of that program, this is a way of rewarding folk that come out into the community like Matt and I, either speaking or hosting user groups like this. And Microsoft reward you with a little bit more presence in the community and some free stuff, but it just gives you a platform to be able to do what you enjoy doing and have the tools to do it. So if that's something that interests you, by all means, talk to either Matt or myself. If you're here, then that's easy. If you're on Zoom, perhaps just hit us up on Twitter or LinkedIn or something like that. So tonight we've got Matt Lacey talking about, are we really doing XAML the right way? I've been using XAML since Blend 1, which that must be 2003 or 4 or 5 or something. Yeah, so a long time ago. So it's been around for ages. And so I guess there's a lot of scope for folks to not be doing it the right way. And that's what Matt's going to be talking about. Normally there would be another slide instead of that blackness after this saying what we're doing next. See the blackness? Well, that's because it's the summer holidays and we won't be coming back until September. So we'll let you know in due course what the next meetup is. And with that, we'll do the jiggery pokery with cables and screen sharing, and we'll let Matt get on with his talk. So if you've got any questions, just put them in the chat. And I will ask Matt at a convenient point. And if anything's not working, as I say, just come off mute and start shouting because we want to make sure you have a good experience. So with that, I'll stop sharing. Oh, that's
we'll swap over in the sound issues.
Yeah.
So now I can't hear. Well, in that it was coming through both. I'm confident that it is picking up my voice.
Yes.
So I'll try not to turn this way too much. But so because hello internet, hello room, sorry, hello internet, because of the way the room is and because of the way the screen is, and because given the chance, I'd be standing up and running around and pointing at the screen and getting all really enthusiastic, but then you won't be able to hear me. And my throat's a bit sore, so I can't shout. So I'm going to sit here to try and stop me running over there and pointing excitedly at the screen. But you can see the screen in the background, and hopefully that's all good. So great start with a cough.
That's just clearing the throat.
Okay. So I want to ask the question, have we been doing XAML the right way forever? Oh, I haven't got my clicker. Oh, I'm sat here. Oh, let's see how this works.
Old school.
Right, so I think it's fair to, so I'm going to assume you know what XAML is. Sorry, people who don't. It's UI markup for .NET native applications. Oh, I have told you what XAML is. And it's fair to say, I think it's fair to say, and I haven't yet anyone who disagrees with me, that XAML isn't the best loved technology in the world. So those lovely people at Stack Overflow, every year they do a survey. This is last year they ran a survey, or they've probably done one this year as well. I should update this. And in the results of their survey, they identified that there are, how can I make that go away? Is that better?
Yeah, that'll work.
So they identified that, so they did lots of questions, there was lots of analysis, clever people looked at the results, and they said, someone identified, who was his name, Adam, he identified that languages, based on how developers think about them, fall into one of two categories. Either they're dreaded, or they're loved. And loved languages are either new or have like regular updates or have wonderful tooling. And based on both of those things, XAML definitely doesn't fall in the loved because it doesn't have great tooling and it hasn't been updated. And it's like 17 years old now. And that's like almost as old as my son. And he's learning to drive. So yeah, old. Okay. So some people are, so I'd like to argue that we're kind of really only on version 1, maybe version 2 of XAML. And some people will dispute that. They will say, but there's all these different versions of XAML. You know, you've got the WPF version and the Silverlight version and we got the Xamarin Forms and the Maui and the UWP and the WinUI and all the WCF stuff. And there's loads of different versions. But while there are different default namespaces and they have some different controls, what they've introduced very little new functionality. The only real bits of functionality of like importance, I would sort of claim, are compile types and variations in the XBind syntax, so you can do a little bit more. But basically, we're kind of version 2, maybe version 3 a push of something 17 years old isn't the greatest, I don't think. And so it's not new, and there's lots of complaints about the tool. So this is a real quote from a real person. I probably should have masked their name. Sorry, Raf. And it was more than 3 days ago. But I see comments like this almost every day. People complaining about the lack of tooling, the lack of quality tooling. Why haven't Microsoft built a thing or made this thing that used to exist in WPF also work for Maui or for WinUI or for whatever else they want to complain about? Because it's the internet and that's what it's for, complaining, isn't it? And then, so we've got XAML, but XAML, as I said, 17 years old, but XAML also now has to compete with other technologies. If you wanted to build a desktop application or a native mobile application 10 years ago, you know, HTML wasn't really an option. Well, actually, 10 years ago, there was long, big debates about whether you should build native mobile apps with HTML. Facebook said you shouldn't because they wrote a really bad app with HTML. And so everyone said, oh, Facebook doesn't do it. And then all the clever mobile people I know, well, yeah, but Facebook did it really badly. And of course you didn't do it badly. But anyway, HTML wasn't an option in the past, but it is now if you want to build an app. And also if you want just a simple application, well, you could just use a low-code tool and you could have something in half a day maybe, depending on the complexity. And yet we have XAML as this is the default UI tooling or UI framework for building your native UIs. And how does XAML compete with that? It's a question. Oh, so many challenges. What are we going to do? So some people will tell you, look, XAML's not great. Let's just forget it. We'll just write the UI in C#. So .NET people in a C# world. I'm sure there are other languages, but they're not as important or as good, are they? No, good. Right. So this is the from the .NET MAUI markup repository sample code for how to put 2 lines of text in a grid on a data template. And that's a lot of code, I think, for just putting 2 lines of text repeatedly on a screen. Even if that's wonderful in C# and lovely, and one of the arguments is if you do it in C#, you can write less code. This is the XAML equivalent, and the text's bigger because I can fit more lines of code on. And you might look at that and go, well, some of those properties are on 2 lines, or you've got multiple properties on the same line. But that's exactly the same properties on the sharing a line as were in the C# example. Rewind on YouTube to test me. And that's great, you know. But, and so we have this, and so what's the problem with XAML? Yeah, but no, there's no good tooling. If we do it in C#, we can build C# tooling. Okay, if the problem is XAML hasn't got great tooling, I wouldn't start with, let's rewrite everything in another language and build tooling for the other language at the same time. That seems like more effort and a potential for more work than is necessary. Why don't we just say, look at XAML, maybe we can improve some tooling, and I'll show you a few little things. Or maybe we could think about writing XAML differently so it doesn't have some of the problems which plague it at the moment. So what are we going to do about this? So I want to set the premise of we should be treating XAML like a proper programming language. And what do I mean by a proper programming language? No mention of Turing. I just want it to be easy to read and write and understand, and easy to work with, easy to maintain. I want to pick up someone else's code and for them to easily work with it, or someone to pick up my code and easily work with it or understand with it, or not have those periods of time where, oh, I've got to go into that code base, oh, and I dread the thought of it because I know it's going to be horrible. I want to write code that's easy for other people to maintain, and other people are me tomorrow because I've forgotten everything that I did today, or at least most of it, and I'll have to pick it up again. I don't want to have to rewrite everything in C# and then work out what the best way to do it in C# is, and hope that someone somewhere has got some best practices for writing UIs in C#, which they haven't told us yet, but they will suddenly tell us. Because I don't want to rewrite in C# and then do it what turns out to be a bad way either. We know some of the basic principles of what makes good XAML. Let's just focus on them. So I mentioned this before we started. If we treat XAML like a proper programming language by my definition is anything in a file which you compile into the application. Brilliant. And these are great ideas. I say that with my hat on, with my smug face on. But I would love to be wrong about this. I would love for someone to come along and say, oh, the fact you're writing C# the same way you did 15 years ago, that's fine, and that's actually the best way. Because I don't want to have been doing it wrong for a long time. I don't want to be the only person speaking up going, hang on a minute, why are we doing it like this? Can't we be doing it better? Shouldn't we be doing it better? Why aren't we applying those best practices from elsewhere to this? Why are we just happy to accept that it's not great and just complain to Microsoft? Okay, so I'm going to give you my thoughts. This is the penny for your thoughts. This is a British expression if you're on the internet. But, you know, I would love, not just for the sake of my voice and my throat, this to be, you know, an opportunity for you to share your feedback and your thoughts if you have them. But I have given talks like this before. And on one of the first talks I gave, first times I talked about this, someone turned around and said, I've never seen XAML done well before. And that's kind of an unspoken thing, because I haven't yet met anyone who can give me a really good idea of what good XAML looks like. Think about the programming languages you work with. If someone said, what does good version of that code look like? you'd have an idea, wouldn't you? Or at least I hope. But this was a senior developer who'd been working with it for years, that they didn't know what good looks like is bad reflection on all of us as an industry, because we kind of just go, yeah, it doesn't really matter. If you were that person's boss, I'd be concerned. Okay. So someone else said, I already do this, what I showed them, for all my other languages I use, but not for XAML. And also that's a really common idea that's come up many times when I've spoken to people about this. Because for some reason, there's this idea in the world that it's only XAML or it doesn't matter. And the same people will also say, but it's rubbish. It's hard to work with, it's verbose and it's complicated and it's messy and there's just too much going on and it's hard to maintain and it's really fragile. Those same people are also going, it doesn't matter. That's a concern, I think, as well. You know, if you were writing your C# and any old code, any old where, any old how, it doesn't matter, the rest of your team would speak up. You would speak up. You wouldn't go, that's just C#, it doesn't matter. And yet we kind of accept this for the UI. I kind of think UIs are important. I think they're very important because they're the bits that the users interact with. And when you have bad user interfaces or buggy user interfaces, it reflects badly on the whole application, all of the software. If you can't get the bits people can see right, how can we trust you can get the bits they can't see right? And then when it comes to, oh, I just need to make a small, simple change, and oh, it's XAML, it's going to be really hard, it's going to take ages. Well, that's not good for anybody. It's not good for developers because they don't work in like that. It's not good for the business because you don't want simple changes to take a long time. So let's think about this, because you already do this in other languages, in other technologies. If you're a web developer, you'll come to the end of this and go, oh yeah, it's just like we do that, or that's like React, or that's like this. Yeah, let's do it for XAML as well. And so someone, one of the first times I gave this talk, they said they'd never seen XAML before, much like yourself, never worked with it. And they were like, what you've shown me is that makes total sense, but why on earth is XAML like this? That's a brilliant question, which means I get to talk about history. The history of XAML is long and complicated, and no one really knows where it started. Well, I've heard like people like who should know better say it started in 2003, but the first version of WPF, which included the first version of XAML, came out in 2006. So officially 2006. There were previews before that. XAML started 2006 with WPF, then got used in Silverlight, then got used in other things, different versions of Silverlight for the phone, then WinRT, UWP, WinUI, XAML Informs, MAUI. It also got used in WCF, but that's but not for UI, so we'll just not mention that. And over time, the tooling got less investment. The number of people working with the tools got less, the number of people building the tools got less, and we got less stuff. But amazingly, the way people try and write XAML hasn't changed. So I went back to the very first WPF book to be published, and the example that you get in that for how to write a simple XAML app involves putting a button on the page, clicking the button and counting how many times it's been clicked. And that's the same example you get by default in a brand new MAUI app today. The examples haven't changed. The ideas haven't changed. What people are being taught hasn't changed. And you think 17 years and things haven't changed. That's a bit concerning. Now, if I was to ask you to go back to using C# from 17 years ago, or, you know, if I say XAML is version 3, let's go back to using C# version 3. Would you enjoy that? Would you like that? Would you want to do that? What would you be missing out on? So you'd be missing out on async and dynamic and lambdas and all the wonderful goodness we have today, not just all the stuff with Roslyn and the tooling, but language features. And yet with XAML, like nothing, it's just, it looks the same. If you don't know what you're looking for, you can look at code written today and look at code written 16 years ago and not be able to tell the difference. And in some ways that's good, but in some ways that's really bad. Because if you want to maintain that old code, that's good. If you're writing the same code, which is long and complicated today, not good. So yes, times change. The way we use XAML hasn't. So let's think about doing things differently. So I want to show you some examples. We're going to look at some just really basic computer science, IT concepts. I'm going to have some examples in C# and then see how they look in XAML. So I want to start by thinking about formatting. So I did ask the internet what makes good XAML, because when people come back go, I don't know what good XAML looks like. And what people said is formatted consistently. That was their idea of that's as good as it gets. This is the baseline. This is where I'm starting. I want well-formatted XAML to start with. If that's as good as you're going to get, okay, but we can do much better. So let's think about formatting. So here is some C# code. And if you saw C# code that looked like that, if you work with C#, you would go, what on earth's going on here? Let's just fix this up. And actually, the IDE would try and fix that up for you. It would not, you have to go some, hence the green lines down the side indicate where I've made changes to make it look this bad. It's inconsistent. There's weird things going on with formatting. There's line spaces. It's a hot mess of code which you don't want to be dealing with. So the first thing
ChatGPT gives you.
we'll come on to ChatGPT and XAML in the future, but yeah. But you wouldn't do that, would you? You say, no, the first thing I do, we just want it standard so I can easily understand it. I don't want to be trying to work out why there are line endings here or wraps here or breaks here and why is all this white space? Is it supposed to be there? Does it matter? Is it significant? No, just forget all that, format it consistently. Wonderful. So that's our starting point. And yet every XAML file, most XAML files in the world are horribly messy like this. We have the same, mixtures of tabs and spaces, not as important, but weird inconsistent indentations, weird inconsistent use of white space, lines wrapped or not wrapped, things sharing lines which could or shouldn't. It would be wonderful if I could just have Visual Studio make it lovely. But while Visual Studio can do a tiny bit of simple XML formatting, essentially, it doesn't do a very good job of making XAML better. Or formatting XAML consistently and nicely in the way you would want to work with. So first thing we're going to do in terms of working with XAML is we're going to install this extension called XAML Styler. Brilliant tool, terrible name. It does not do styling in the way that XAML thinks about styling. This is a formatter. It will format your code, lint it, wonderful. But it's called XAML Styler and it means we can have XAML files which look like this. Oh, it's consistent. All the things are always in the same order, the order I define. That's nice. I'm not going to be searching around looking for things which could be anywhere. We've got consistent indentation, so I can read it more easily. I don't have to question, well, why is that indentated and that's not? Does it matter? I've got better questions to ask when I'm trying to understand someone's code, not why it's badly formatted. But the reason I think we don't care about XAML formatting is because of this guy, Microsoft Blend. So Blend was a tool. Technically, it still exists. It just doesn't get updated. And so it doesn't work with a lot of things anymore. Blend is a tool intended for designers to work on UI design. So pre-WPF, we had WinForms, where everything is drag and drop to create the code. You can't really look at what's happening under the scenes about what happens when you drag things around and resize them and position them and move them around. And so we have Blend, which kind of gives you that functionality, but we also have the XML or the XAML available to us underneath. And the thing about Blend is it's a machine, it's a robot. It doesn't care about formatting and white space and leaving black lines and moving things around all over the place. So I think everyone using XAML just kind of stopped caring about white space and moving things around and things being longer than they have to be, because that's what the tool did, so that must be right. But the problem we have now is people aren't using Blend or other tools to design to write the XAML. They're writing the XAML directly. And so writing it as if you were a tool, as if you were a machine, if you were a tool, probably not the way to go. So we got formatting out of the way. We're formatting consistently. We're ready to think about proper things, real things. Let's think about responsibility. I want to think about responsibility in terms of the single responsibility principle.
This week I had stuff to order pizza. We might be going through the requirements. Cool.
So, solid principles. there are clever people who object to some of them, but in general, I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with the single responsibility principle. The idea that my code does one thing at a time, has one reason to change, and I will combine bits of code and then I'll get everything I want. Wonderful. Here is a horrible C# example. This is a lovely contrived example that if you've ever seen someone talk about the single responsibility principle or read about it, you have probably come across the idea of a overly complex shopping basket. Here is my shopping basket. Here is one method where it takes my shopping basket and places an order. It does some validation, it does something with an invoice, it does something with a database, it does something with an SMTP client. It's doing an awful lot. It's kind of trying to do everything, and that's probably a bad thing. It's definitely a bad thing. This is my contrived example. I would have put more in it, but this is all I can fit on so it's readable. But this is a standard XAML file. No one thinks twice about writing massive XAML files, which you can't read because, well, they're massive, and so you can't fit it all on the page in a way that's readable. But anyway, this is my irresponsible code, and so you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't do that. You'd break that down. You know, forgetting the weird inconsistent validation, the fact that the exception handling is definitely not as good as it should be, the fact that you could create an order and then things go wrong if it doesn't save to the database, or you could create the order in the database and not send an email, and all sorts of things. There's lots of things that could be better about that code. So let's think instead about some XAML. Or with that in mind, let's think about some XAML. We're going to think about a really simple UI. We've got a window. There's some stuff at the top, but in the bottom right-hand corner, I want 3 buttons. Simple, yeah? Assuming you know XAML, not a problem. If you know XAML, you're probably going to create a grid. So you'd have some row definitions and column definitions. You have some buttons down the bottom. The buttons are what we care about. And they'd probably look something like this. So we've got a button A, where it says where it goes, and it's got its margin, and it's got its click event. You might use commands, not click events. That's fine. That doesn't really matter for now. But you'd have something like this. But I look at that and go, hang on a minute. That's for each of these buttons, we're doing at least 2 things. We are defining our button, what it looks like and what it should do, which might be 2 things. But we've also got the code for where it goes, how it's positioned relative to other things. It's dealing with what it looks like and how it relates to everything around it. That's 2 things in my book. As an example, why this matters, imagine we wanted to add a button B. What do we have to change to add a button B? Well, we're probably going to have to change our column definitions to get another column in, and that's not even on the screen. And then, well, we might have to change the margins because there's weird things going on about different margin values between different things. And then we'd have to change some of the other buttons to put them in different columns. So to add one thing, I need to add my new thing, and I need to change at least 3 other things. That's an example of why the single responsibility for the SRP is important. And if we were making a more complex, that was just one simple button. If we were making a more complex change, it could easily get very complicated. So instead of this, I would like to propose something like this. Forget for a minute you've never seen a row of buttons control. But guess what the row of buttons control does? It takes care of putting everything in it in the right place and with the right spacing between them. And then my buttons are just the buttons in the order I want them in. Now imagine I want to add a button B between buttons A and C. I'm just adding my button. I don't need to change anything else. And what is my row of buttons? It's just a stack panel that I've said, well, space it like this and lay it out like this. It's just a really simple class. Yes, it's C#, but so what? XAML and C# work together. There's no rule that says you can't create user controls in C#. If this was not about UI, you would not think twice about creating a simple class to encapsulate some logic and potentially reuse it in other places. but it's XAML and it doesn't matter and we don't really care, so we don't think about it. Oops, sorry. But yet, that's easy to read. If you're coming to a code base you're not familiar with, or XAML you only work with every now and again or have never seen before, you could make a simple change there and it wouldn't be a challenge. But what I've done is I've stopped using grids for everything. And I'm not saying do not use grids for everything, because there are people who will tell you, use grids for everything. Just put it all in a grid. But grids get complicated. They have their uses. You know, in that example, I would have my row of buttons in the bottom row of a grid probably, but I'm not using grids for everything. You don't have to. And one of the reasons people use or say you should use grids is because grids are more performant. However, unless you have a very complicated page, it's hard to even measure how much performance benefit you get from using grids. And if you want to say, I don't care, it's the most performant, I will always use it, I would also question whether you apply that rule to the rest of your code base. Is every bit of your code base written for maximum performance? Or do you do other things to maybe make it easier to read and write? You know, have you ever written, do you have a for each loop? Well, a for each loop is less performant than a for loop. Do you use link? Well, link's not as performant as other things. If you're not going to argue that performance is the most important thing, and you must always use the most performant thing regardless of everything else, don't do that. You know, be consistent. I think that's what I was going to say. Be consistent about your rules. If this is your rule that performance is the most important thing, absolutely. If the performance of your UI is the most important thing, and it is measurably slower by not using grids, absolutely use grids. But when less performance is a problem, the priority in your code base is probably maintainability. And having a row of buttons with some buttons in it, as I showed, more maintainable than just doing everything with grids.
John D made a nice analogy. He said, grids are like forgetting where your keys are. You know, they're in the house somewhere, you just don't know where.
Lovely, John. Some people have also heard me say that and said, but all the stuff you got rid of, or most of the stuff I got rid of was attached properties. Should we not use attached properties? I'm absolutely not saying that. Attached properties are great. They have lots of uses, but they are not something you should use everywhere. I think of attached properties as being like extension methods in C#. You know, they're great, and when you have to use them, they're invaluable, but you don't use them for everything. So, you know, use things appropriately. Oh, my row of buttons again. Funny thing about my row of buttons, it's doing a lot more than I've told you. You might have realized it, but that name is really important. Because if you just look at the XAML and you see row of buttons, how do you think they're laid out?
Right.
What do you think should go in them?
Buttons.
Yeah, so if I put an image inside a thing called row of buttons, that'd probably at least make me ask questions. It's almost as if naming is important, isn't it?
That's the longest thing to do in your entire application.
Right, so let's start by looking at some C# again. We'll go back to looking at some C#. Beyond the most trivial of demos and code that you definitely do not need to run, even in a minute in the future, you would never call something do stuff, would you? You would give it a useful, meaningful name. Imagine, if you will, a scenario where tax is really simple. And calculating tax is really easy because all you ever have to do is add 20% to something. Oh, that'd be brilliant. So we could write a method to do that. If we're just adding on 20%, we might call our method add 20%. We can put in a value, it's going to give us a value 20% higher. Wonderful. Would we call that method add 20%? I hope not. I would suggest calling that something like maybe add the tax or get the value with the tax applied. Because at some point in the future, the tax rules are going to change. And it won't always be 20%. It will get much more complicated, or the value might change. But if we've called our method add 20% and used it in lots of places in our code, and now the tax rules have changed, what do we do to our add 20% method? Do we change the name of the method? Or no, do we just change the content, the functionality, but still leave it called 20%? Or we wouldn't want to do that because that'd be really hard to maintain. Do we change both? Do we create an add 20%, or do we change it so it's now add whatever the new rules are, or just add whatever the tax is and put the logic in there? But now we have to go and we have to work out, well, of the places where we used it, were all these places that are calling add 20% actually just needing to add 20%, or were they just to do the tax? Because there might be other reasons to add 20%. And if I'm in a code base and I need to add 20% and there's a method called add 20%, why shouldn't I use that? We could say, oh, well, in some cases we need to add 20% and some places we need to add the tax. We should create both. And now in our add tax. And now we've got to go and work out which of the ones are the add 20% and which ones are actually doing tax, and then change those methods all over the place. And so just to make a simple change, which we could have probably predicted was coming in the future, we've had to change potentially an awful lot of code in an awful lot of places in a code base. And we don't want that. And it's all because a bad name was chosen. So here are some real names from some real XAML files. Well, okay, the bottom one isn't XAML, but we'll get to its UI, so I think that's permissible. This top one, this margin, this is from a Microsoft best practice way of doing it. We have a margin called medium left-right margin. 4 pieces of information, one of which is barely useful. The others are completely not useful. What does medium mean? What does left-right mean? Okay, it's a margin, so I should probably use it as a margin. That's the one I'm going to give you. But what does medium mean? It's a placeholder for a number, probably. What happens if that number changes? Does it matter if we've used it in different places? Where should I be using this? So it turns out, this actual example is intended to be used on a page to set a consistent page border on every page. So I think it'd be much more useful if it was called page margin, standard page margin, something that tells me what it does, but more importantly, tells me where I should use it, so I don't use it in the wrong places, or if someone tries to use it in the wrong place, it stands out. If I use something called standard page margin for something else, and then I go in and change the page margin, and things look weird in other places, it's kind of on the person who used it in the wrong place. I've got a thing called page margin, and I'm using it internally within a button to do something with an image. Well, why did you use a page margin for that? That's kind of problem. What I want to do is use a name that tells me where and how I should use it. Like this action red button. Okay, so it's a button. It's probably red. Doesn't tell me where I should use it. It turns out this is actually the default button within the application. Okay, so what happens when someone decides, oh, we want to change the design and the default button should now be blue? Well, we're back to our issue of whether we change the name or the content or both, and how do we know we're using it in the right place? If we'd call this default button, oh, it's fine, it's the default button. I can look at the XAML and go, oh, I know that one's the default button because it called it. Obvious, really. You know, if I've got 2 default buttons on a page, well, hopefully that's going to make me raise some questions or ask some questions. And yet no one does this. Oh, I touched upon magic values earlier when we talked about pricing and tax. Remember tax? Remember when it was simple and it was 20%? We could write code like at the very top. Price is the price plus 20% or times 1.2. But you wouldn't do that, would you? Because 1.2, oh, we'd end up with 1.2s all over the place. We might define a constant. We'll call it tax multiplier. That's great. So we can at least be clear when we read our bottom line, oh, this is just the price plus the tax multiplier or times the tax multiplier. It's fine, I understand that. I don't have to go, what's that 1.2? When 1.2 changes, I don't have to go and look at all the other places which in the code base which just happen to have 1.2, but aren't anything to do with this. It's fine. We've got our tax multiplier. If we need to change it, we change one thing once. Let's think about some XAML. So here's my list. I've got a list in my app, And in my list of each item, I've got a border, and within my border, I've got an image and some lines of text. Simple. You see it in almost every app. Image with some text next to it, in a list, repeats over and over, but doesn't always have kittens, sadly. What would the XAML for this look like? Well, if you know XAML, you could probably imagine it looks something a bit like this. Got a border with our grid and the images. So this is a Maui example. The last one was WPF. I'm just showing general XAML. Nothing that I'm showing is specific to any kind of type of or flavor of XAML. All this applies regardless of what you're working on, whether it's WPF or UWP or WinUI or XAML Forms or Maui or whatever comes in the future. I don't know if something's coming in the future, but maybe. We shall see. So here is my XAML for my list, or for each item in the list. And immediately we see some magic values. What's sea green? How do I know that's the right type of green? What happened? Oh, maybe it's from the branding. We just use sea green. Okay, what happens when the branding changes? I've got to go and look everywhere and change all the instances of sea green to whatever is the new color. What's this spacing of 4 and 8? Are they right? Why is 8 repeated multiple times? Yeah, may or may not discuss that. These values. You'll see these values all over the place, but why? And when if we need to change them, we need to change them everywhere. We don't want to do that. So what we could do is we could create a resource which encapsulates those values and just use that. So we're now using the reference to the value rather than the value repeated all over the place. Oh, but here's the thing. This is from that earlier example as well. Some of those numbers get repeated an awful lot. Wouldn't it be great if we could just say, well, we'll have a number, and rather than repeat it all over the place, we'll just reference the value. And if you're really eagle-eyed, you'll see the little green squiggle near the thickness, and that says that's not valid. And it's not valid. Okay, so let's just do something else that is valid. We'll just create our own version of a thickness, which we can bind these values to. Because no one said you can't. And yes, you could just like set them all once because they're all the same thing. But it's really easy to do. People look at that and go, it must be some sort of magic, but it's not. It's just an implicit operator on a type. I've created a class, so now I can bind to it. Oh, and if it needs to be a thickness, it just automatically gets turned into a thickness. But in 16, 17 years of working with XAML, I've never seen anyone else try and do that. But why on earth wouldn't you? Because it means I can not have to repeat myself in the same value all over the place every time. I can make a change once and have it applied to a whole application. Oh, it's lovely. So we can apply that. We can do things with values not having magic numbers, but there are other kinds of magic numbers, other values that get repeated all over the place regularly. Typically with text formatting, people will go and say, it needs to be this size, it needs to be this weight. And what you can do is you can define resources that define that. So you can say, so someone, you might be working with a lovely designer who comes along and says, for our application, these are the colors you use across the top. Here's how the text should be. So the text is either a display or a headline or a title or a label or a body or a caption, and that's all. And whenever you use one of those things, this is how it should be. So we've got that defined, and we can create a resource which defines that, and then just apply the resource. It looks like this. So here we go. So we've got our label, the top label is binding it to the title, and the style is title text. That's, title text. That's good. I should be able to use that for a title. That makes sense. But I think we can go a bit further. I look at that, and it makes me think we should probably be using more types. So let's think about custom types. Might have another sip. When it comes to custom types in XAML, there are basically 3 kinds. You can have user controls, you can have custom controls, which are like a templated version of user controls, or you can have this magic bottom category, which are lightweight or inherited controls. And we saw one of them earlier with the row of buttons, but these are massively underutilized, I think, and are an easy way to make changes and make code much more reasonable. So let's think about C# again. Imagine you had a class, which is a person, and they have, the person has properties, and maybe you have a class called student, which inherits from person. Brilliant. And I'll need to write a method which does something with a student. Would you, like in the first example, pass in a person and cast it to a student because you always know you're going to get a student? If you didn't, then you would check, obviously. Or if you knew you're always going to get a student, why wouldn't you say, just give me a student? You'd do the bottom one, wouldn't you? You don't want to have unnecessary casting. Well, you see, I look at this and I see a parallel. I read this as the top line, give me a label, and then I'll, excuse me, give me a label, and then I will turn it into a title text version of a label. Give me another label, and I will turn it into a subtitle text version of a label. Give me a label, and I will turn it into a default version of a label, which sounds, when I put it like that, at least to me, a lot like I'm casting. So instead, why don't we just skip the casting stage? Why don't we just say, give me a title, give me a subtitle and some default text. And if you're really paying attention, also just give me a standard border. Well, okay. Our code's getting, well, there's a lot less code on the screen now, but it still does the same thing. It still produces the same output. But hopefully, you're starting to appreciate, not only is there less code, but it's also easier to read. The names have meaning, which helps us understand. If we were writing HTML, we'd be all about semantic markup. And the reason the web has lots of semantic markup, not just because it's easier to read, because it also helps your SEO. There's no SEO here, but it still helps it be easier to read. I'm not finished. Oh, lots of skipping. Oh.
Doesn't want to show that one. It's a trick slide.
It's obviously very important. So what are these types which we just magically created? And again, they're like the row of buttons. They're very simple types. All I've done for my standard item border is just a border and automatically applies that style. My title text label is just a label and it automatically applies that title text style. Very simple, very easy to write. I've written lots of them. However, you probably don't want to be creating lots of those types yourself. That's very good. You have better things to do. So here's the output from a tool. On the left-hand side, we have a resource dictionary. It has some, going down, it has a couple of colors, a brush, and then some types. So there's like 4 definitions of button styling. The bottom one is the implicit style. And if we look over on the right-hand side and read up, we'll see we've got an error button because it didn't mention the implicit style. And it's automatically created a super button and a standard button. Wonderful. Then we've got this class of brushes, which is just the names of the brushes. Because sometimes you have to refer to these things in C#. And what you don't want is to have to be writing magic strings all over the place. Because as you'll see with the colors, it's really easy to make a mistake. So there's an accent color and there's a secondary color. But because the demo gods were with me, when I created this, I put an extra capital O in color. Oh, and so, okay, so I can go and change that and I could change it in my style, in my resource dictionary. And it would now automatically change and update the content on the right-hand side. What I don't want to be doing is going through my code base, searching for all the instances of secondary color which have got the row capital O in it and having to change them everywhere. I want to change it once or refer to a constant which can, identify if I make those weird changes. So that was very small. This is the bigger version. So again, we see at the top, we have the button. This is our error button with all our properties, but we automatically create this error button class, which is just a button and it applies the style to it. But how did I make that? What I did is I went into Visual Studio, having installed an extension, and I just said, use this custom tool. Now, custom tools are great. They're actually really easy to write, but you have to know about them and you have to have them installed in Visual Studio, which can be a problem if you're not using Visual Studio. It can be a problem if not everyone on your team or everyone working with the code base has the same tool. So it would be better if we just install a NuGet package like this one, and it will automatically do that for all the resource dictionaries anyway. All you have to do is build your code base and you get all those extra classes. You don't have to set properties, you don't have to install an extension, it works everywhere because it's just a NuGet package. Now, if you are paying far too much attention and have spent far too much time working with XAML, you might look at that and go, well, what about all the seal types in WinUI 3 where I can't just inherit from them? And I would go, stop making excuses. Let's look for solutions. Why don't we automatically generate proxy wrapper classes around those types, which we can inherit from, and we just expose all the methods and the events and the properties through the proxy. And then we can still set style on it. You use an implicit conversion like we saw earlier, and it works wonderful. You might say, oh, but in malware, you can't refer to merged dictionaries in the same way. And I'll say you can, but it's more code. But you can get to them in a different way. Not a problem. We might create a helper, we might not. You might say, someone asked me, does it work with a designer? At which point I went, what designer? And I went, oh yeah, WPF still has a designer. And yes, it works with the designer. So here you can see I'm using a my text block below a regular text block, which is applied in the my text style, and it's big and red. That was what that's showing. So yes, that works as well. Oh, but there's more. Imagine you are working with a lovely designer who says, we want you to build this app. Here's everything. This is what it looks like. And that can be good. But if you look at this, there's more going on here than is apparent. It's intentionally really small because there's a lot. You can't see it. I had to take out the bits where you could read the names. But so we've got this big complicated app. And if you could see the details of this big complicated app, you would realize that there's a lot of repetition, a lot of things happening all the same. It's not just a case of, oh, I've got text blocks that are the same and text is the same everywhere. There are other things going on. For at least half the pages in this app, there is a title bar at the top with some icons in it. Then we've got the body content and yeah, there's titles and icons at the top and then the body content below. So we might, on every page, have a grid with our row for our title bit, and then our top navigation bit, and then everything else underneath it. And obviously we want to get rid of those hard-coded values, so we'd have our standard page gridder header values for the rows. Removes one challenge, but we can go a lot further. So what we ended up creating was a grid for page with navbar. Guess what that is? Guess where you should use it? And I wouldn't write the logic in it like this now, but this is what we had back in a couple of years ago now. It just makes that spacing about the tops the same. It's all defined in one place. We can use it everywhere. And so we have code that looks a lot more like this. We have a grid for a page with navbar. We have our top navbar control with some top bar icons in it in a container. And then we have everything else underneath. Having worked on a large code base like this, it soon became much easier to work with. We knew where everything was. When the designer inevitably came along and said, oh, actually, could you make that bar a bit bigger everywhere? We didn't have to go to every page and change it. We made one change in one place. Really quickly, you could see the impact. But we've created loads and loads of types. Are we going to stop for pizza or are we going to keep going?
No, you're okay.
Okay.
Stays pretty warm.
Okay.
It's a
We're not going to make all the people on YouTube watch us eat pizza.
Yeah, we are, yeah.
Oh, okay.
They need to come first.
So we created all these extra types. That's what we did. Some of them from a tool, some of them we might have written ourselves. But how do we manage them? Well, they're just C# classes though. How do you manage C# classes? Does it matter if you've got lots in a single folder? What do you do if it does matter? Well, you create other folders and namespaces and things. I'm sure you have code bases which have hundreds, if not thousands of types in them. You can manage that fine. This doesn't need to be any more of a challenge. And if things are getting automatically generated, really don't need to think about them. And you may or may not want to put them in source code as your preferences dictate. So talked about a bunch of stuff. Let's put it all together while I can still talk. So we started out, and we had like really big, horrible, massive XAML files. This isn't big. This is like this is a small page with like 20 controls on it, but it's like hundreds of lines long. Ridiculous. So let me ask you a question. Would you rather fight one horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses? Would you rather work with one massive class or lots of little classes?
Yeah.
Would you rather work with one massive file or lots of little files? Regardless of horses or ducks, you probably want to work with lots of little things. It just gets easier over time. So let's put this all together in an example. This is the .NET. This is the app you will build as part of the .NET MAUI workshop. If you do the .NET MAUI workshop, it is a simple application that displays information about monkeys. It has 2 pages. The page on the left is like the main page. It has a list, which has an image and some text next to it, obviously. And when you click on one of those, you get to the image on the right, the page on the right, which just has more details. This is the page on the right, except obviously, even when I make the text really small, you can't fit it on the screen. So if I squeeze it all onto the screen, it looks like this, and obviously there's loads and loads of text there, and you're instantly scanning it, looking, and you're seeing, wow, there's so much there, and all those numbers get repeated, and there's all sorts of complications going on. Can it be better? Yes. So before, I should have counted. How many lines is that? 5, 30, 40 lines? The text is now much bigger, is kind of the clear indication that, you know, there's a lot less of it. On that image on the right-hand side, the image from the app, there are 7 things on that screen. There are 7 elements on my XAML page. People who've never worked with XAML before, would you rather come to a new code base and see something like this, or the really big one? If I said, hey, we've got this app, it's got some information about monkeys, it's got like the text and it's got their location and their population. We've got this other information in the data model. We've got like the life expectancy. We want to put the life expectancy on the page, put it above the location. Not knowing any XAML, could you look at this file and work out how to put the lifespan on there? And if I said it needs to be formatted like the location's formatted. You could probably eventually work out how to do that on the longer version, but you've just looked at this and like in a few seconds gone, yeah, I could do that, that's easy. Wouldn't it be great if you could look at a XAML file and go, yeah, I can change that, that's easy. I can be really confident that's not going to have any unintended side effects or consequences. Because, you know, it's a reasonable bet that there's no UI tests on your code, because no one writes UI tests on their XAML files. And by no one, I mean most people. And if you're one of the people who does, congratulations, have a special prize. But look what we've got here. Look, I can add white space to make it more readable. You wouldn't do that on a regular file because there's so much that you couldn't get to anyway. Look, there's wonderful things there. There's a vertically scrolling page. Guess what that does? Yes, it's a page and it automatically scrolls vertically. Hey, of course. Previously, I've got a content page. Inside that, I've got a scroll view, and inside that, I've got a vertical stack layout. I'm 3 layers deep before I start. I've got all my complicated logic about the header, which is that block of color and the circle of the image. That's just all extracted and put somewhere separate because it's complex logic. Well, let's just pull that out. If you had a complex method in C# or whatever programming language, you go, well, this bit's kind of on its own and it makes the whole thing really big. Let's just pull that out and reference it. You wouldn't think twice about doing that. But making a separate control or component in XAML is something everyone's a little bit wary about. I've got my page details. Yeah, it's just that's where the details of the page go. And that takes care of the spacing and the padding and the margins and whatever. And then I've got my text buttons and my text button. Oh, it's a button I put text in. Well, obviously. And the only things I need to specify are the text and what happens when you click on it. Or look at the top. I've kind of collapsed all the namespaces, the namespace aliases. That's a bit cheating, isn't it? Because like, if I go to a real file, I can't do that. Oh, but of course I just like built a tool which does that because it's really simple. And so this is really from inside Visual Studio. And yes, you can collapse the namespaces because I don't want those 6-7 lines of text at the top of every file just taking up space. I have a fork of .NET MAUI, which means you don't have to specify namespaces. It has the equivalent of a global usings file, but for namespace aliases. However, while I can make .NET MAUI understand that, Visual Studio and all the other tooling around XAML files don't like that because it's no longer valid XML. And everything that works with XAML assumes that a valid XML file, a XAML file is a valid XML file because it's supposed to be. So I was essentially building another version of XAML to support that, and everyone else doesn't like that.
You built that tool to collapse the namespace? Yeah,
so I built the tool to collapse namespaces instead, rather than rebuilding a whole language or version of the language. So that was much easier. So there we go. Simple class, which is easy to understand, simple file, easy to read, modify, wonderful. It was very different from the one before it. I am not saying you should rewrite all your XAML so it looks and uses all these things and is wonderful. I'm saying I have used some simple basic principles which you wouldn't think twice about applying to C#, which you probably do, but don't even think about it. And when I apply them to XAML, oh, it makes my XAML much smaller, tidier, easier to work with. Why not? Why not start applying some of these things? You don't have to do it all at once, but this is what we did. We started by having consistency and having a tool to enforce that consistency, because you don't want to be doing code reviews, which are, oh, you should be adding more white space. Oh, that's not indented, right? Because you have better things to do with your time. We looked at single responsibility, naming, not having magic values, which meant we took out a lot of duplication, and we created some simple custom types. It's all just stuff you do in C#. I am not doing this on all of my classes and all of my projects everywhere. I'm doing bits as they're appropriate, but it's made me think about other things differently as well. So here is a button which I have added a behavior on because I want it to be true. I want to have a function, a command that runs when I right click on it, and buttons don't have that by default. So I have to do a behavior, and look, it's like 7 lines of text. Who wants to be writing 7 lines of text? Well, if you're a tool, it doesn't matter. I'm not a tool or a robot. So I said, well, why don't we make an attached property which can just do this for us? And so my 7 lines of text are now just a single property. And I didn't like writing event to command, so I just had a version, an alias for it of E to C. Because that was just having a class inherit a class and not change anything but the name. And now it's even simpler. I came across some code which had lots of lines like this. And I'm like, I have no idea what E0, E3 is. So I made different versions. I called them chevron left, chevron right, chevron up, and chevron down. Because I understand that, and I have to think about what that might be. Makes the code much easier, not just for me, but for everyone else coming to work with it as well. I had some text blocks where I couldn't use resources for reasons, but I was having to set lots of properties on them. And I saw some of the things that web developers get to do. I got a bit jealous, and we could just like set them all as one property. So I made a thing called min fonts where I can just set all the properties in one go. And yeah, some people don't like it, but I'm kind of growing to like it. And then I thought about styling, and yeah, let's do the same sort of thing. Because yeah, building components is great, but I know from my web developer friends that components can have issues. especially when you have loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of them on a massive project. And maybe you just want to set properties directly. Maybe you're a Tailwind CSS fan. It's kind of a bit like that. And then I had a gradient. Gradient's a horrible look. I just wanted a simple gradient, which went through, I didn't really, this is an exaggeration, but simple gradient, 3 colors. It could be far too many lines of code for me to even count, or I can build a custom markup extension, which just takes the colors and does that. Because it's easier to read and it's easier to maintain. And it means there's less code overall. I love it. So that was everything. I wrote a book. I've written 3 books. The most recent one is called Give a Great First Technical Talk. It is a very short read. You get it on Amazon. It will show you how anybody can give a short talk on anything technical and guaranteed success, or I'm wrong. And if you're interested in .NET MAUI, I have a tool called the MAUI App Accelerator. It's like a bootstrap for building apps with .NET MAUI, so it'll help you scaffold out the app, so you can choose like lots of lovely options. And rather than start with like a blank app or an app where you have to delete the default code, you've got loads of functionality which will help you get started faster. So you can also check that out or ask me about it if you have questions. But that really now is the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got a question. I've got a question in the chat. Which extension does the XMLNS, the namespace, collapse?
It's one of my ones. I can't remember which one it is now.
The man has written so many extensions, can't remember which one it is.
I have like more than 50 in the Visual Studio Marketplace. Ping me directly on Twitter or GitHub or something, and I'll point you in the right direction.
Sounds good. Any? And Stefan's written a monologue. Hold on. You mentioned treat XAML text like any other programming language. Now I'm wondering, is there a XAML parser that you suggest use within Roslyn analyzers to build diagnostic tools for XAML text? Wow. Oh, I like it. Always good from
So hang on, I don't know what I'm sharing. Hang on, am I sharing my screen or
sharing? Yes.
Oh no.
Tell you what you're sharing.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna stop sharing so I can change. How do I stop sharing?
It kind of looks like you're sharing.
Right. Let me find. Let me share this. So what was the question again?
Essentially, Roslyn tests for XAML text.
Yeah, wouldn't it be great if you could do Roslyn style analysis for XAML files? And I thought that too many years ago and discovered that no, there isn't any built-in way to do it. And writing a thing to make it possible is much more complicated than I could ever possibly have imagined. And then porting that to Visual Studio 2020 was also full of headaches. But I have this project which kind of used to be sponsored by Microsoft, called the Rapid XAML Toolkit. And it's a bunch of tools for helping work with XAML. And one of them is the ability to do Roslyn style analysis of XAML files. This is kind of this is the old version of the website we're looking at now. So I can write a rule which says something like, my user control must always have an is enabled attribute. And actually, it also powers a whole bunch of XAML analysis. So I can do things like, so hopefully you can see this. Let me try and make it bigger. So this is the output from a Visual Studio screenshot. So here we can say we've got a squiggle somewhere, line 21. Oh yeah, we're using a grid of row 2, but there isn't a row 2 defined. You haven't specified an input scope on that text box. A whole load of things. Oh, I've got a list of them somewhere. Oh, somewhere. So there's loads of things it can do, and it's extensible, so you can build your own. That was the thing I was showing initially. And how do you build your own? Oh, it's all configurable. It's wonderful. So if you've ever had to write a Roslyn analyzer, you know it's in two parts. You have to write the analyzer and then you have to write the fix. I thought that was too complicated, so I just I do it a bit differently. I say you define like a method somewhere. This is where's the code example? It's so simple I skipped over it. No. Oh, I thought I had a nice, helpful. I was apologizing to someone on GitHub earlier today that the documentation's not great. Oh, is this it? Yeah, here we go. So you create something, create a class that inherits from the XAML element processor. Seems simple enough. Oh no, this is the old version. You create something that inherits from iCustomAnalyzer. Where's the analyze method? Is it even in here? I have like a vague description of it rather than the actual thing. So the iXAML analyzer has two things, two elements. We could probably look for it. Should we look for it? So we're on your board. Here we go. Visual Studio 2022. In the code. In V6. Probably. Oh, that's nice. Oh. What happened there? Oh, that's a complicated one. Let's look at that. But it should be able to take us to the come on. So this is the interface. You have a string which tells you what types it works on, and you can do wildcarding, and it can do multiple values, and there's operators and things it supports. And then you implement this method called analyze. Or can we find examples of where this is? And that gives you a representation of the XAML, but in a smart way, so you can do things to it. And it gives you some extra information. So it'll tell you like what type of project you're in, if that matters. It'll tell you some extra configuration things. And then you respond with some analysis actions. And analysis actions are like, well, do nothing if there's nothing, or it could be like, well, actually, you might need to add an attribute, or you might just want to have a message, or you might want to change loads of things. And I go to this as well. This is what analysis actions are. Go on. Oh no, that is this line. Show more. Well, here's an example one. Oh, this is the one from that example, in fact. Okay. So it says, does the element contain an attribute is enabled? And it will handle whether that's a property attribute or an element attribute. And if there's nothing if it does, that's fine. So we can say just return nothing. I'm aware this is very small, so let me just. And if there should always be an is enabled attribute, because that's what the rules say, you just say, well, respond with a add attribute. Is it a warning? Is it an error? Is it just a suggestion? Has it got a code? Give it a description. The action text is what happens when you click on it, or the context menu suggestion, the code complete thing. I can't remember the name right now. And this is the attribute to add. And this is the value. And it takes care magically in the background of implementing all that if someone does come along and click on the thing.
I like it.
So in terms of XAML parsers, yes, there is one because I wrote it. The docs aren't brilliant. And you can find it all on the interwebs.
I like it.
Or ping me later, but yeah.
Yeah. Alaladi, and apologies if I've mispronounced your name, has said the main problem with XAML is limited IntelliSense, and I agree with that, to figure out things, debug and all. For example, today at work, I was told to change a custom control, easy, C# XAML, where the custom control site SITS was supposed to have it look like this below. And if you wanted to
Oh,
have a look, you might not be able to actually see it on the screen, but at least you'll be able to see it. Scroll right to the bottom of that list. Keep going down.
where is the bottom?
There it is, that
Oh, yeah.
one just there. So if you click that, just click it, it'll maximize on the screen. Well, normally it does.
Oh, no, it's opening up.
What the heck is that opening? Paint.net. Oh, that's fair enough. You can still zoom. I like that it's opened it in that. There we go. I was able to tell them of another way to achieve the above. I didn't do this because IntelliSense is not available to figure things out. Is there any way IntelliSense can be invoked? I like that. IntelliSense for example would be, I mean, it does do a little bit, doesn't it? But
It does do a bit. There are limitations on how it can be extended. So one of the problems with XAML in Visual Studio is that no single person owns it or no single team owns it. And the implementations for WPF, WinUI, UWP, and Maui Xamarin are owned by different teams, and they don't all just share a code base, which would be lovely. And so the extensibility for different versions of XAML is different. I have only looked at so yes, there is limited IntelliSense. It would be great if it was better. You invoke, it can be invoked in the same way that regular IntelliSense can, because that's just a standard editor feature in Visual Studio. This is more information than you asked for, I'm sorry. But you can extend it. However, and I only know this from the Windows side, I haven't looked at the other side, it's not a standard extension point. And it will only let you extend lists already there. So if IntelliSense can show you something, it's possible to build extensions which will show you other things as well. If IntelliSense currently shows you nothing, then you can't do anything then. That's kind of the limitation there. So yes, it's bad. I wish it was better. If there are different ways of doing things, and I would recommend always having those conversations with the people you work with, because it will help other things in the future, especially if you can do them, in parallel, don't have to rewrite everything.
Good.
Oh,
Any questions in the room?
I scared you with my overly complex answers.
No, that's cool. I mean, had we not had the discussion earlier about resource groups, resources, generally resources, my question would have been, which one are you going to go for? Because resources work quite nicely as far as naming styles are concerned, and reusability, and those resource, what are they called? The resource dictionaries.
Yeah.
You can use and spread around, you're a bit like CSS, I guess, spread around your application, and you only have to change things once. But I do love the idea of having, the ability to be able to have IntelliSense dot something, or at least when you're typing in the name of a style, you don't have to worry about magic strings, as you've said. So I understand that delineation, but is there a good case for both?
So I'm not a fan of absolutes in any kind of way. So yes, it depends. If it's a small app, do what you like. If it's just you, do what's best for you. If it's likely to grow, then think about other things. My preference is just define everything at app level resource-wise, unless you know this is never going to be needed anywhere else. It just saves moving things around. And until you have performance issues, then I worry about performance. So I just put everything in separate resource dictionaries, link them from the app level at the app objects, do that way, and then automatically generate all the types for them, and then just use the types. Is my preferred way of working now. I can't remember what your question. You just asked about resources in general.
Was resource dictionaries versus your types idea, essentially.
I define resource dictionaries and then automatically generate the types from them, and then just use the types.
Well, that answers the question then.
Yeah.
So both.
So
really,
yes, yeah. I'm using both. You can with those automatically generated types, you can still use the resources as you would normally, because they still exist. All I've done is created an extra thing which I'm using to mean that I don't have to define type and property. I can just use new simplified single type, which is hopefully more meaningful as well as being shorter.
If you do that, is there some limitation with overriding things? Because I think you can inherit from other resource dictionaries and override bits for different pages. But if you're doing something in the code as well, is it get complicated, or is that just a complicated question?
So resources still work the same. You can override properties on the custom types. If you then also started defining weird inheritance structures within the tree,
Probably
I'm sure there's possibilities for things to go wrong, but then I'm hoping you've got a good enough reason to do that you're able to get around it. And if that's the problem, well, just don't use the generated type, just go back to the other way, add in the comments, say why you're doing it.
Cool. Any questions in the room that aren't me? Who's used XAML in the room? Well, nobody. So this is your first experience of XAML. Nice.
I'll cut you off.
No.
Yeah. Really. It looks, the methods that you've spoken about makes it look less daunting.
Good.
How it's originally looks.
Yeah. But hopefully you've also seen that the principles of one language can be applied elsewhere, and that's, if you're not doing XAML, at least you can take that away. And it's good to ask questions about, well, what tooling would I like there to exist, or could I do this differently to make it more maintainable? Or, okay, you say everyone does it that way, but can you explain why everyone does it that way? Because I wish I'd asked that question a lot earlier now. I remember when I showed an early version of some of the other tooling, demo tooling I've built, which I'll spare you now. But I showed it at, I got to show it at a build conference in 2018. And then people were just coming up to me going, where were you 10 years ago? I wish I'd known to ask 10 years ago. So hopefully I can start to help people think a bit differently about XAML and provide some tooling to make it a bit easier, even if it's just simple things like being able to collapse namespace aliases.
Code sprawl is my biggest. And also collapsing things, keeping things as minimalistic as possible. And yeah, all of those namespaces at the top and the styles, you start being lazy, and it's very easy to be lazy if you're under time pressure, or perhaps somebody's asking you for something quicker than you really want to do it, or you don't want to have to refactor stuff, then those pages get very big very fast. And it seems far easier, and he kind of highlighted that, far easier to do that in XAML badly than it would be in C#. I don't know the difference in mind spaces when you're working in something like this. I guess it's not too different to working in HTML and CSS, where it's very easy to just add something. CSS, add something in that file. We won't create another file. We'll just add it to that file. And the same with the HTML, we'll just add stuff rather than, I guess, if you use something like Angular, creating user controls, and there is some symmetry between front-end JavaScript frameworks and this as well. And that you should always, if you can, make user controls to be able to take some of that code out of that page and code XAML rather than C# of course. But yeah, I love user controls. Are great. I do like that, but you've got to get it in your head how it works. It's not always obvious.
Yeah, and so just starting with just write a simple C# class. Just get into the habit of, I can do a simple thing, I will do the simple thing, and it makes it better for me and everyone else in the future.
Yeah.
Hopefully I can start to spread this message.
Well, I think that's all the questions in the room and the chat now. So with that, thank you very much, Matt. That was awesome. As I mentioned before, we are going to be taking a break for a couple of months over the summer holidays so that we can go and relax and do whatever we do in the summer holidays. After that, in September at some point, we will have a speaker that we need to organise yet. If you are a .NET speaker, you can either speak in person or remote, and by all means get in touch. There's a Sessionize page, sessionize.com/.NET Knots. Do propose your talks on there, and we take a look and we go through those regularly. If you've not been doing so, make sure to tweet on the hashtag .NET Knots. You still have time. Again, if you're not in the UK, then sorry, the book offer isn't open to folks that aren't in the UK because of costs. But the JetBrains license, and we may actually give away 2 because of spare licenses. So you might be lucky enough to win one of those. So yeah, keep in touch, and we will catch you remote folks again soon. We're going to go and eat pizza. And there's no better reason to come in person to .NET Knots. Apart from the view that you get from these wonderful BGSS offices, and go and meet some of your peers as well. So do please come back in September, come in person if you possibly can, but we will continue running in a hybrid fashion because we'd like to be inclusive like that as well. So so thank you very much everyone, and we'll catch you again in September.